Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on non-citizen voting. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. As Americans, we know that to be self-evident truth listed in the Declaration of Independence. But it really was something truly unique both at the time and in human history. We as American citizens are not ruled, we govern. The way we do that is at the ballot box. But President Biden and Kamala Harris's border crisis poses a direct threat to this fundamental right, and it is intentional. Radical progressive Democrats' near universal opposition to both H.R. 2 and the SAVE Act prove that this is all by design. Now, less than 2 months before the 2024 election, this threat could not be more real. Last week, I released a 36-page report detailing the scope of the border crisis. The report illustrates how Biden-Harris open border policies are fundamentally remaking America. More specifically, it analyzes how the massive influx of illegal aliens under this administration, on top of the millions of non-citizens already living in the United States, could upend federal elections for years to come. Since President Biden and Kamala Harris took office, over 8.5 million illegal aliens have crossed the southern border. 5.6 million illegal aliens have been released directly into the United States. Almost 2 million illegal aliens that we know of have evaded Border Patrol as what are called gotaways. Taken together, at least 7.5 million illegal aliens have entered the United States since January 2021, and they are living in every corner of the country. This year, the foreign-born population hit a record of over 50 million, 15.6% of the total population, the highest level in U.S. history. Conservative estimates show non-citizens make up about 30 million of that population, but it very well could be much higher. Non-citizens will vote in the 2024 election because our system not only makes it easy to do, but incentivizes doing so. The Biden-Harris administration baselessly claims it is extraordinarily rare for non-citizens to illegally vote in federal elections. A 2014 study from professors at Old Dominion University and George Mason University estimated that 6.4% of non-citizens, 1.2 million individuals at that time, illegally voted in the 2008 election. The study concluded that non-citizens very well may have tipped the 2008 Minnesota Senate race in Al Franken's favor and drove President Obama's victory in North Carolina. We can debate the merits of that study, but the point remains. It would only take a few thousand non-citizens voting, much less than the 1.2 million estimated, to impact the outcome of our razor-thin elections. In the 2020 presidential election, regardless of what you think, Arizona was carried by about 10,000 votes, Georgia by about 12,000 votes, Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, and Pennsylvania by 81,000 votes. Democrats know this, which is why they try to downplay and distract from the issue. The other side also loves to point out that, quote, it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote. That is technically true. They fail to mention that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, or the NVRA, literally prohibits states from verifying citizenship during the voter registration process. This means it is impossible for states to enforce the law on the front end. Consequently, the primary defense against non-citizens registering to vote is a literal box-checking exercise on a voter registration form. This is the only barrier the American people have to ensuring that only citizens vote. Because of the Supreme Court ruling in Arizona, an individual who can prove they are a United States citizen is given a full ballot that includes all federal, state, and local elections. But someone who cannot prove they are a United States citizen is given a federal-only ballot, meaning they can vote in presidential, Senate, and congressional elections. That is the upside-down world that we've created. As of August 9th, there were over 41,000 federal-only voters in Arizona who could not prove they were U.S. citizens. Think about that. But the absurdity of the NVRA doesn't stop there. It also forces states to provide voter registration forms to applicants for driver's licenses or welfare benefits. This presents multiple opportunities for non-citizens to register to vote. Every state in the union allows non-citizens to get a driver's license. 19 states and D.C. even allow illegal aliens to get a driver's license. And millions of non-citizens, including many illegal aliens, are eligible for welfare benefits. We know the NVRA is broken because non-citizens are registering to vote and voting. Since 2021, Texas has removed over 6,500 non-citizens from its voter rolls. Over 1,900 had voting histories. Since 2022, Virginia has removed 6,300 non-citizens from its rolls. Alabama removed 3,251 non-citizens from its rolls. Ohio identified 597 non-citizens, 138 had voter histories. The states that are doing the right thing and removing non-citizens from their voter rolls are fighting with one arm tied behind their backs because they get almost no help from the federal government. And Democrat-run states appear to have made little to no effort to clean their voter rolls of non-citizens. I introduced the SAVE Act to ensure that non-citizens, whether knowingly or unknowingly, do not take advantage of our flawed voter registration system. The bill is a simple bill that requires states to obtain proof of citizenship before registering an individual to vote in federal elections. A recent poll found that over 80% of Americans support requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote. SAVE Act's proof of citizenship requirement will ensure that non-citizens do not register to vote, but is easier for U.S. citizens to comply with than driver's license applications in states like New York and Pennsylvania. The bill also requires every state to identify and remove non-citizens on their voter rolls and gives them immediate, no-cost access to federal resources containing citizenship data to do so. Finally, it imposes penalties on officials who illegally register non-citizens to vote. It passed the House in July, with 5 Democrats supporting it. Unfortunately, 198 Democrats, including every Democrat on this subcommittee, voted against it. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has refused to hold a vote on the bill in the Senate, and President Biden even threatened to veto it. Now Democrats are threatening to shut down the government because they are so vehemently opposed to preventing non-citizens from voting. So I asked my Democrat colleagues one simple question: why? And the answer is obvious. My colleagues want citizens to legally vote in 2024 election and future elections. It's the only reasonable explanation after forcing years of chaos on the American people. They believe this will help their election prospects and advance their quest to fundamentally remake America. As Congress, we have a constitutional and moral obligation to ensure that does not happen. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that this is our first subcommittee hearing after the passing of our dear colleague from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee. Sheila was a fierce, fierce advocate for her constituents and an ardent defender of American civil rights, particularly voting rights. Her contributions to this subcommittee and to Congress and the country will be deeply missed. And of course, I wish that you were here today to push back on the lies, the innuendo, the half-truths, the speculation which form the basis for this hearing. This week, less than 2 months before the presidential election, House Republicans have threatened to shut down the government unless the Senate agrees to pass the anti-voter bill under consideration in this committee today. The SAVE Act would impose unnecessary obstacles upon the ability of American citizens to register and vote, and would do real tangible harm to our democracy by preventing American citizens from voting, by causing chaos at election bureaus, and by undermining faith in election results. This legislation, crafted with the help of election deniers and some of the architects of Project 2025, is part and parcel with Republicans' ongoing effort to undermine faith in our elections and to create unnecessary barriers to casting a vote, particularly by suppressing the votes of young Americans, communities of color, and language minorities. Former President Trump and his allies are once again using the same old playbook, spreading a non-citizen voter lie as part of a cynical campaign to undermine faith in our election systems. In 2016, the former president lied when he claimed that millions had voted illegally only in the states that he lost. They didn't. In 2020, he lied about the security and accuracy of mail-in ballots and claimed that voter fraud was the reason he lost that election. It wasn't. Now he's lying again, this time about non-citizen voting, in order to set the stage to challenge the 2024 election results if he loses. The repetition of those lies doesn't make them true, but it does make them propaganda. And the SAVE Act and this hearing are part of that propaganda campaign. We've seen time and time again, here in Congress and in state legislatures across the country, that bills combating non-citizen voting are really about politics, not policy. These bills are not rooted in reality, but are instead widely used to stoke anti-immigrant fear and hatred. Now they're being used to sow distrust in our elections as well. Because contrary to the claims you'll hear today, non-citizen voting is extremely rare, and the so-called evidence that our colleagues and their witnesses cite has been repeatedly discredited, with both large-scale studies and even basic internet research. But the lack of a rational or evidentiary basis for this legislation is far from the only serious problem with the SAVE Act. This bill would be a disaster for eligible American voters and lead to the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of American citizens. We know that bills like the SAVE Act, which require onerous and unnecessary proof of identity or citizenship to vote or register, are more likely to suppress the votes of American citizens, especially in communities of color and those with many recently naturalized citizens. More likely to do that than to prevent the infinitesimally small number of non-citizens who might mistakenly cast a ballot. We've seen the dangers of these types of laws in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where I reside, and elsewhere. In 2012, the Pennsylvania legislature passed an onerous voter ID law to combat the equally non-existent problem of in-person voter fraud. That law's requirements would have disproportionately burdened low-income, minority, elderly, military, and disabled voters. It would have disenfranchised over 500,000 eligible voters who were unable to easily obtain the limited forms of ID that were required. Civil rights advocates challenged that law on behalf of Pennsylvania voters and won. Troublingly, the SAVE Act goes even further than that state law, including requirements to register for a federal election that would burden every eligible American voter, but especially those that don't have ready access to documents like a passport, specialized real ID, or a birth certificate. And it would impose additional burdens upon already registered voters who simply want to change their address or party affiliation. It would require states to use unreliable database information to verify citizenship. And election officials would be charged with purging suspected non-citizens from voter rolls in a way that inevitably targets naturalized American citizens who are eligible voters. That's something we've already seen happen in states like Alabama, Texas, and some of the others that the chairman mentioned. The SAVE Act, if it were to become law, would take effect immediately in the days immediately preceding the 2024 election, throwing states' voter registration processes into chaos. And it would provide even more opportunities for extremists to waste time and taxpayer dollars with baseless lawsuits and frivolous election challenges. So here's the truth. Voters are already required to declare their U.S. citizens under penalty of law. That's because every state has prohibited non-citizen voting in federal elections since the 1920s, and it's been a federal crime for nearly 30 years. Because it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote and register in federal elections, doing so could result in significant jail time and deportation. It defies common sense that large numbers of non-citizens would intentionally risk these dire consequences to vote. And think about this. The criminal act of non-citizen registration and voting, by its nature, creates a long paper trail of registration forms with addresses, ballots, paper ballots, etc. Every reliable study ever done on this topic has determined that non-citizen voting in state and federal elections is vanishingly rare, and usually the result of mistake. One such study conducted by the Brennan Center for Justice using data from the 2016 election found that out of 23.5 million votes cast in jurisdictions with high non-citizen populations, election officials found only 30 votes were cast by suspected, but not even proven non-citizens. That's 1/10,000% of the votes cast. So the facts simply don't justify the hysteria or the threat to American citizens' franchise. Even the former chairman of this subcommittee, Speaker Mike Johnson, has admitted that claims of non-citizen voting in federal elections were not provable. The bottom line is the SAVE Act won't prevent non-citizens from voting in U.S. elections because they don't, but it will stop Americans from voting, and that's unacceptable. Look, the reason we're having this hearing now is that Congress must fund the government by September 30th to avoid a shutdown. House Republicans have shown by their failure to engage in good faith budget negotiations or pass the number of appropriation bills that need to be done, they aren't really interested in the basic duties of governance, but they do want to stay in power and to gain power in the Senate and in the White House. That's why they're supporting this voter suppression bill instead of working to fund the government over the next 20 days. So here we are, holding this farce of a hearing on a dangerous bill targeting a non-existent problem, a bill that's already passed the Republican-led House but is a total non-starter in the Senate. Rather than making it harder for American citizens to vote, we should be protecting and expanding access to the ballot box by passing bills like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And it's deeply disappointing that Republicans have chosen instead to spend this subcommittee's time appeasing the former president and extremist election deniers ahead of November. Democrats, however, intend to keep working to ensure that every eligible citizen will cast their vote and have their voices heard, because that's what the American people deserve. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. See, we're off to an agreeable start, as we always are. But I, too, want to say that we will miss the gentlelady from Texas and her presence here in the subcommittee. And I, too, wish you were here for a no-doubt spirited debate. May she rest in peace. The chairman of the committee not being present would now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to start off by commenting on the unfortunate absence of our late departed friend, Sheila Jackson Lee. Mr. Chairman, Republicans rely on the false premise that there is widespread non-citizen voting in order to advance dangerous legislation like the SAVE Act and other burdensome, unnecessary measures requiring proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections. In fact, it is measures like the SAVE Act that represent the true threat to the right of American citizens to vote. As with so many of the Republican majority's proposals, proof of citizenship requirements for voting in federal elections is a solution in search of a problem. American voters are already required to declare that they are U.S. citizens when registering to vote. Federal law already makes it a crime for a non-citizen to vote or to register to vote in federal elections. And the consequences for non-citizens who vote are so dire that it strains credulity to believe that they are doing so in significant numbers, especially when the criminal act by its very nature creates the evidence of the crime. The data that we have on this so-called problem backs this up. Every credible study has concluded that non-citizen voting in federal elections is practically nil. That has not stopped Republicans from making the wild charge that non-citizens vote in significant numbers, even though, as former chairman of this subcommittee and current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said, it is not provable. So Republicans and their extremist MAGA allies at organizations like the Heritage Foundation, the incubator of the nefarious Project 2025 blueprint for a potential new Trump administration, have resorted to spreading deceptive videos about non-citizen voting on social media, as the New York Times recently reported. We've seen the MAGA playbook, and these extremists have run some version of this play for years now. Indeed, without a doubt, it is the same playbook Donald Trump is again relying upon to delegitimize the 2024 presidential election so that he has a pretext for challenging the results if he loses. And how do we know that? Because the very same people behind his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, based on lies and deception, are now spearheading the effort to advance the SAVE Act. One of them, Cleta Mitchell, who was on the now infamous 2020 call during which former President Trump asked the Georgia Secretary of State that he, quote, just wanted to find 11,780 votes, close quote, is even at the witness table today. In other words, Cleta Mitchell participated in the plot to steal the 2020 presidential election, and the Republicans have the nerve to call her as a witness in front of this committee today. Ms. Mitchell now chairs the so-called Election Integrity Network, which the New York Times referred to as an effort to recruit, quote, election conspiracists into an organized cavalry of activists monitoring elections, close quote. Given her history as a lieutenant in Mr. Trump's efforts to overturn election results, are we, or the American public for that matter, supposed to find her testimony credible when she alleges widespread non-citizen voting? We're not that stupid. The SAVE Act and the false premise of widespread non-citizen voting underlying it is based on the same tired conspiracy theories we have all become accustomed to hearing from the other side. But it is not just some ridiculous talking point meant to question the legitimacy of the upcoming election. These burdensome, unnecessary proof of citizenship measures are also an extension of the Republicans' insidious, decade-long effort to suppress the voting rights of American citizens, especially those of color and those from emerging ethnic and language minority groups. Contrary to what the majority might say, measures like the SAVE Act will weaken the right of every eligible American citizen to vote, all to address a non-existent problem cooked up by MAGA extremists ahead of the next election. Imposing onerous proof of citizenship requirements to register for a federal election will burden every eligible American voter, but especially those who do not have ready access to documents like a passport, birth certificate, or military service record. It will disproportionately impact voters who are poor or elderly or disabled, as well as military service members overseas and women who have changed their names after marriage. Based on previous state-initiated efforts to require proof of citizenship to vote and efforts to purge suspected non-citizens from state voter rolls, we know for a fact that the SAVE Act will disproportionately impact naturalized citizens and language minorities, who also tend to hail predominantly, though not exclusively, from racial and ethnic minority groups, the very groups that federal voting rights laws are also intended to protect. It will further heighten the risk that election officials charged with purging suspected non-citizens from voter rolls will target naturalized American citizens and language minority communities. I wish I could say that these are unintended consequences, but the truth is, to the bill's supporters, voter suppression is a feature, not a bug. I would suggest to the chairman that the important constitutional prerogative of protecting voting rights entrusted to Congress would be better served if this subcommittee focused on advancing measures like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965, rather than holding a hearing on a bill that is based on a false premise, has already passed the House, and is dead on arrival in the Senate. With that, I look forward to the witness testimony, and I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. The Honorable Cord Byrd. Mr. Byrd is the Secretary of State for the state of Florida. He previously served in the Florida House of Representatives, where he was a member of the Public Integrity and Elections Committee, including a term as Vice Chairman of the committee. Mr. Byrd also chaired the State Redistricting Committee and served as Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee. Ms. Rosemary Jenks. Ms. Jenks is co-founder and policy director of the Immigration Accountability Project, a nonprofit organization that works to advocate and educate the public on questions of immigration policy. She has worked on immigration policy in a variety of organizations for more than 30 years. Cleta Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell is a senior legal fellow at the Conservative Partnership Institute and the founder of the Election Integrity Network. She has worked in private practice for many years, counseling clients on campaign finance and election law matters. Ms. Andrea Senteno. Ms. Senteno is the regional counsel of MALDEF's Washington, D.C. office, where she oversees the organization's legislative and regulatory work and litigation activity. Previously, she served as a legislative staff attorney at MALDEF, working on immigration and voting issues. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative, and they've been seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered in the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony and limit it to 5 minutes. Now, I'm going to advise you all that votes are being called imminently on the floor of the House. They have been called. When were they called? All right, we're going to proceed, and we'll make a decision on whether we go through some of you or all of you, depending on the vote time, but I'd like to move forward a little bit. So, Secretary Byrd, if you don't mind starting, you have 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. In 2004, the bipartisan Baker-Carter report, prepared by President Jimmy Carter and Chief of Staff to President Reagan, James Baker, stated that, quote, fraud in any degree and in any circumstance is subversive to the electoral process. and that the best way to maintain ballot integrity is to investigate all credible allegations of election fraud and otherwise prevent fraud before it can affect an election. Voter fraud includes voting by non-citizens in federal elections. Every illegitimate vote of a non-citizen negates the legitimate vote of a citizen. Nationally, preventing non-citizens from registering to vote and voting is the #1 priority of states committed to election integrity. To put the issue in context, Florida has approximately 13.5 million active registered voter, and that number changes every minute of every day. According to USCIS services, 94,100 Floridians became naturalized U.S. citizens in 2023 alone. That is a large number, but in elections, small numbers matter. As a reminder, in 2000, only 537 votes in Florida determined the outcome of the presidential race. Miami-Dade County alone, Florida's largest county, has over 715 precincts. A single illegal non-citizen vote at each precinct can change the outcome of our presidential election. The NVRA of 1993 introduced national procedures for voter registration. It mandates that any person who applies for a driver's license may, if eligible, submit a voter registration application for federal elections to determine whether the person is registered to vote and to confirm whether the person is, in fact, a U.S. citizen using the SAVE database. Once the investigation is complete and if the department determines that the person is a registered, is not a non-citizen, due process is afforded and the non-citizen is prohibited from voting. Florida is committed to ensuring that all eligible Floridians can vote. However, we are equally committed to preventing election fraud and protecting the integrity of Florida's voter rolls. Despite conducting a fair and honest election in 2020, Florida did not rest on its laurels. In 2022, for example, Governor DeSantis signed a law creating the Office of Election Crimes and Security. This is not a fake or contrived issue. In Florida, we are prosecuting and convicting non-citizens who are attempting to fraudulently influence our elections. Florida law states that a person may become a registered voter only if that person is a U.S. citizen. And in 2020, Floridians amended the state constitution to make clear that only a citizen of the United States shall be eligible to vote, and that amendment passed with more than 80% of the vote. Floridians have changed our state's constitution, we have strengthened our laws, we have engaged in litigation, and we have an office dedicated to investigating election crimes. The only impediment to doing more is the federal government. That's why states need action from our congressional leaders so we can fulfill our constitutional duties under the law. In conclusion, I leave you with the words of Mark Twain, who said, "Citizenship is what makes a republic." I implore you to work with the states to ensure that our republic remains strong by only allowing American citizens to vote in American elections. Thank you.
Secretary Byrd, thank you very much for that. Ms. Jenks.
Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing. I'm Rosemary Jenks, co-founder and policy director of the Immigration Accountability Project, IAP. As the name implies, we focus exclusively on immigration policy and how it impacts America, including our elections. IAP is also a founding member of the Only Citizens Vote Coalition. As you know, the Immigration and Nationality Act makes an alien who falsely claims U.S. citizenship, for example by registering to vote, or who illegally votes, inadmissible to the United States and deportable from the United States. 18 U.S.C. 611 also makes it a federal crime for a non-citizen to vote in a federal election. Based on data from the Census Bureau and the Department of Homeland Security, we estimate that there are currently around 30 million non-citizens residing in the United States. The open borders policies of the Biden-Harris administration have added at least 7.5 million of these non-citizens on top of regular legal immigration in just the last almost 4 years. Obviously, this massive population of non-citizens would have no impact whatsoever on our elections if they were securely prevented from voting. However, the requirements of the 1993 Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter Law, and the 2002 Help America Vote Act make it virtually impossible to prevent non-citizens from registering to vote, either accidentally or intentionally. Neither a driver's license nor a social security number provides proof of U.S. citizenship. All 50 states and the District of Columbia issue driver's licenses, including real IDs, to lawfully present non-citizens, while 19 states also issue driver's licenses to illegal aliens. Moreover, every alien who is authorized to work in the United States is eligible for an SSN. The Biden-Harris administration has been handing out work authorization documents like candy to inadmissible aliens, with SSN issuances following close behind. So we have federal voter laws that do not require proof of citizenship to register to vote, combined with a massive population of non-citizens with valid driver's licenses and SSNs. When you add to that President Biden's unprecedented Executive Order 14019, along with the huge network of NGOs receiving billions of dollars in federal, state, and local funding to provide services to the millions of illegal aliens being released into our country by the Biden-Harris administration, you have a recipe for fraud. There are strong indications that some of these NGOs are providing the aliens with voter registration forms. For example, the contract New York City signed with an NGO called Homes for the Homeless to provide migrant housing includes a requirement that the NGO, quote, provide and distribute voter registration forms to all persons, end quote. Imagine you're a new arrival to the United States with limited English proficiency. If a government official, whether at the DMV or some other agency, or an NGO paid by the government to take care of you, hands you a form and says, just check this box and sign your name, you're probably going to comply. And as soon as you do, you are guilty of a deportable criminal offense. You have essentially been entrapped into a criminal act by a government agency or NGO acting either with indifference or with nefarious purpose. Do we at IAP believe that millions of non-citizens are going to show up at polling locations to vote in November? No, but some surely will. The problem is that once a non-citizen's name is on the voter roll, that name can be attached to a ballot and voted. In states that automatically mail ballots to registered voters, a ballot will be mailed to whatever address the non-citizen provided, whether it's the address of a migrant shelter, a hotel, a homeless shelter, or a residence. What will happen to that ballot and others like it? Will it be harvested, filled out, placed in a drop box? Opponents of requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, including every Democrat on this subcommittee, dismiss those who support it by saying it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote. But they know non-citizens, including illegal aliens, do register and vote. Otherwise, why would H.R. 16, the amnesty bill that all the Democrats on this subcommittee have co-sponsored, explicitly allow DHS to waive illegal voting for amnesty applicants? Why would H.R. 3194, an amnesty bill that 3 of the Democrats on this subcommittee have co-sponsored and the Biden-Harris administration wrote, automatically waive both illegal voting and false claims to citizenship? Why is it okay if even one American citizen's vote is canceled by an illegal vote? What if it's your vote? It's time to pass the SAVE Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jenks. Ms. Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell, can you hit your microphone?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking member and members of the subcommittee. I'm Cleta Mitchell, Senior Legal Fellow at the Conservative Partnership Institute. There are several reasons why the SAVE Act is absolutely necessary. Safeguarding American voter eligibility is and does exactly what the title says. It safeguards American voter eligibility, and it's desperately needed to secure the 2024 elections. The SAVE Act will reverse a decision of the United States Supreme Court from 2013 in which the court ruled that only Congress can direct and decide the content of the federal voter registration form to require proof of U.S. citizenship in order to register and vote in U.S. elections. Quite simply, the SAVE Act would do what the Supreme Court determined in 2013 that only Congress can do, which is to safeguard eligibility for voting in federal elections by requiring documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. With the borders opened on January 21, 2021 by the Biden-Harris administration and illegals pouring across our borders by the millions and being taken who knows where in our country, the SAVE Act has become absolutely vital to protecting our elections from illegal voting by non-citizens. Not only will the SAVE Act require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, but it also contains other components that are vital for the 2024 elections. It requires that states compare their existing voter lists to citizenship data to identify and remove non-citizens who are already registered. It establishes a new criminal penalty for those who knowingly register non-citizens to vote. It requires federal agencies to make available to the states at no cost citizenship data in order that state and local election offices can, in fact, confirm citizenship of persons registered or seeking to register. And one important aspect of the SAVE Act would be to ensure that the 22 states who allow same-day registration, meaning that a person can register and immediately be allowed to vote, will not be eligible to vote until having provided proof of citizenship. This requirement alone will interrupt one of the biggest threats to the integrity of the 2024 election, the organized roundup by political advocacy groups of scores of illegals to register and vote them on the same day before anyone can determine if those individuals were eligible to vote in the election. Democrats oppose the SAVE Act ostensibly because it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in a federal election. Yes, it is. And it is also illegal for millions of people to swarm across our borders without documentation, but nonetheless, this administration, under border czar Kamala Harris, has adopted just such a policy of opening the door and letting anyone and everyone into our country illegally, already against the law. If the Democrats sincerely want to keep non-citizens from voting, then let me ask you, where are the enforcement actions from the Department of Justice? Where are the memos to U.S. attorneys across the nation warning about potential violations of the prohibitions on non-citizen voting? Where is the FBI hotline to report suspicious registrations of illegals? When is the Merrick Garland press conference announcing that it's illegal for non-citizens to register and vote in the election and violators will be apprehended, prosecuted, and deported? Did I miss that public education campaign? I must have, because it doesn't exist. The Democrats' plan for 2024 is to change the electorate. If they cannot persuade the American people to want their Marxist policies for America, just import voters who don't speak the language, don't have a shared commitment to our country and our national principles, get them into the very porous voter registration system and collect their votes. Just Facts researcher James Agresti published a report that a conservative estimate is that there will be, based on his past experience, between 1 and nearly 3 million non-citizens who will vote in the 2024 election. Democrat-controlled cities like San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. have granted voting rights to non-citizens. Leftist groups have fought the citizenship question on the 2020 census. Every Democrat in Congress voted against putting the citizenship question back on the census. Every Democrat in Congress also voted no to apportioning U.S. House seats based on citizenship instead of population. Why? Because California would have lost 4 U.S. House seats in 2010 and 3 more in 2020 if only citizens had been counted for apportionment of the U.S. House. That's not only U.S. House seats, that's 7 electoral votes for the Democrats. It's why Democrats voted no on reversing the decision of the District of Columbia to allow non-citizens to vote. For Democrats, non-citizens are their future political base. Please do the right thing. Pass the SAVE Act. Save our elections. Save our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. And as much as I hate to do this because it's going to cut off Ms. Senteno, I think we need to get over to the floor and vote. So I'm going to apologize profusely, but you get more time to prepare, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. So we will stand in recess while we go to the floor. Thank you all very much. I'm going to call the hearing back in order. Thank you for your patience when we went over to the floor to go vote. We will now proceed with the final testimony, and I apologize again. I know that we had to break, but now spotlight is all yours.
Good afternoon, Chair Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Andrea Senteno, and I am the Regional Counsel of the D.C. Office of MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. For 56 years, MALDEF has worked to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. I thank you for this invitation to appear today. MALDEF focuses its work in 5 subject matter areas: education, employment, immigrant rights, voting rights, and freedom from open bias. Since its founding, one of MALDEF's top priorities has been to secure equal voting rights for all Latinos and to promote increased civic engagement and participation within the Latino community. MALDEF has litigated numerous cases in court to challenge at-large systems, discriminatory redistricting, ballot access barriers, undue voter registration requirements, voter assistance restrictions, and failure to provide bilingual ballot materials. At 19% of the total population, Latinos accounted for 51% of the nation's population growth between 2010 and 2020. Similarly, the Latino population is responsible for significant growth in the U.S. electorate. Latinos represent an estimated 50% of the total growth of eligible voters from 2020 to this year's presidential election. Latinos are expected to make up 17.5% of the total voting population in the upcoming general election, and an estimated 1.8 million Latinos become eligible to vote each year. Despite these facts, there's a misrepresentation that the Latino community is still overwhelmingly composed of non-citizens. But the majority of the Latino population is U.S. born, and 81% of all Latinos in the U.S. are citizens. Unfortunately, national demographic change is often perceived as a threat to too many in political power, and the result historically has been persistent and increasing efforts to suppress the vote and political power of the Latino community. These perceptions of the Latino population and its growth serve as the basis for unsupported allegations of widespread voter fraud, often attributed to non-citizen immigrant Latinos. Yet overwhelming evidence has shown that non-citizens are not voting in U.S. elections en masse. Non-citizens are barred from voting in federal elections, and it's a federal felony to register to vote or vote unlawfully. Every state in the nation currently prohibits non-citizens from voting in state elections. Voters in every state must affirm or verify their citizenship in order to register to vote, and state election officials must verify a voter's eligibility. Numerous studies, such as those by the Brennan Center and the Cato Institute, have shown that there is no significant number of non-citizen voting, and multiple efforts to try to produce evidence of significant non-citizen voting have failed. This makes sense when one considers that unlawful voter registration and voting carry steep immigration consequences, including deportation and the inability to ever naturalize in the future. This voter fraud disinformation targets Latinos and voters of color, and the suppression tactics take the form of things like unlawful voter purges, restrictions to language assistance at the polls, or restrictions to mail ballots. In 2019, Moldova successfully sued Texas Secretary of State David Whitley and others, challenging an advisory to county registrars to single out naturalized U.S. citizens for investigation and removal from the voter rolls based solely on the fact that they were born outside of the U.S. There was an allegation of over 95,000 non-U.S. citizens to be on the voter rolls and thousands to have alleged illegally. But this list was based on erroneous information, including outdated driver's license information. Ultimately, the case settled, and state officials were required to change the way that they identified voters to investigate, as at least 25,000 voters on those rolls on the erroneous purge list were actually U.S. citizens. But these types of tactics undermine the public's trust in our elections and erode voters' confidence in participating in our elections. Unfortunately, H.R. 8281, the SAVE Act, fails to meet the needs of many of the voters in the U.S. who need Congress to lead the way in safeguarding the right to vote against voter discrimination, when approximately 30% of the U.S. citizen voting age population is unregistered to vote. Federal and state legislators must work to encourage voter registration of eligible voters, not hinder it. And safeguarding each eligible citizen's right to vote should not be a partisan issue. Moldova urges Congress to pass H.R. 14, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill would provide voters with necessary and effective tools to push back and prevent voter discrimination where it occurs. We look forward to working with Congress to advance the voting rights of all Americans and ensure our elections make it possible for every eligible U.S. citizen to register and cast a ballot. Thank you.
We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I will recognize the gentleman and my good friend from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are two basic questions implicit in this hearing. The first is, should non-citizens be allowed to vote? The Constitution is silent on this point, so it falls to state legislatures to answer this question for their own elections and for the Congress to answer that question for federal elections. The states in Congress have answered that question clearly and decisively, that American citizens, and only American citizens, have a right to vote to guide the American nation. To me, that's the most fundamental definition of citizenship. And I think that that's a view held by the overwhelming majority of Americans. It's obviously not held by many Democratic officials in the jurisdictions that they control. And the irony is that so many of them, just a few years ago, were complaining about foreign influence in American elections by making internet posts. Now they've got no problems with illegals actually voting in our elections. But that's beside the point. Assuming that most people agree that voting in American elections should be the exclusive right of American citizens, the next question is, how do we prevent the votes of foreign nationals canceling out the votes of American citizens? And to this question, The Democrats tell us, well, that's a non-issue because there's no evidence that foreign nationals are casting votes in American elections. But if you look at the actual studies, that's simply not true. The chairman mentioned the 2014 Old Dominion George Mason University study of non-citizens voting. They concluded 6.4% of non-citizens voted in 2008, and that 2.2% voted in 2010. But that's not the only study out there. In 2014, Stanford University came to a similar conclusion. They concluded, and I quote, the proportion of non-citizens who voted was less than 15%, but significantly greater than 0. Similarly, in 2010, we found that more than 3% of non-citizens reported voting. In addition, the analysis suggests that non-citizens' votes have changed significant election outcomes, including the assignment of North Carolina's 2008 electoral votes and the pivotal Minnesota Senate victory of Democrat Al Franken in 2008, unquote. And that is before the last 4 years when this administration has allowed an additional 7.5 million illegal migrants into the country, a population that is larger than the state of Arizona, our 14th most populous state, with 9 congressional districts and 11 electoral votes. At the moment, the RCP average tells us that only 1.1% of the vote separates Harris and Trump. So if 2% of those votes is illegal, I guess that's the definition of rare illegal voting, well, that means that 2% of Americans' votes are being canceled out by those illegal votes of foreign nationals, and that is more than enough to decide the presidential election. And even if this was not happening, the mere perception of it's enough to destroy public confidence that the vote will accurately reflect the will of the American people. Now, Secretary Byrd, isn't it true that many states have done surveys of their voter rolls and found thousands of foreign nationals on them, and that many of them have a history of voting?
That is correct, Congressman.
Can you give us any additional details on that?
So I can tell you in Florida, we've been at this process for more than a decade. As I mentioned, we sued the Department of Homeland Security in 2012, so we have some experience at this. Since 2022, Florida has removed over 1 million individuals off of voter rolls, some of which includes non-citizens. And in fact, we have 2 individuals who've recently been arrested and prosecuted for attempting to fraudulently influence elections in Florida. This isn't a fake or contrived issue.
Ms. Mitchell, what do you know on this subject?
Well, I included in my written testimony some examples of exactly how problematic it is and how many, I'll give you a couple of examples. The Public Interest Legal Foundation sued the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 2018 to obtain the records regarding non-citizens being added to the voter rolls in Pennsylvania. And the Department of Transportation admitted that there was a, quote, glitch in the system that added 100,000 aliens to the Pennsylvania voter rolls. That litigation is still ongoing because of efforts by the Department of State in Pennsylvania to not answer the questions.
But the Democrats have just told us, no, don't worry about that the penalties are so great that no one would dare to illegally vote. But it's already a federal crime to cross the border without permission to begin with. It's a felony to do so repeatedly. And as you pointed out, that by definition is not acted as a deterrent for any of these individuals. I know in California, you can't prosecute somebody for voting illegally unless you can prove they actually knew it was illegal. And all a defendant would need to say is, hey, they handed me a registration form, they sent me a ballot. How was I to know? And that's a valid point. And how many people are in legal jeopardy and don't even know it?
Well, I think that that's one of the things that people don't realize is that this is a really vulnerable population. And as Ms. Jenks pointed out in her comments, if somebody hands you a form and you don't really speak the language and somebody's shepherding you around and they're responsible for getting you benefits and you're just putting your name on things, how do they know? And that is happening. It is happening as we speak. And I think that one of the things that's problematic is that I also included in my testimony a reference to some announcements by Virginia's governor about removing more than 6,300 non-citizens who are on the Virginia voter rolls. Those were people who self-declared, who realized, oh my gosh, we are on the voter rolls and we're not supposed to be. And there are several other states that have done likewise. So this is not an insignificant problem.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. And, you know, we continue to say, well, it must be like this. I mean, we've heard some testimony about removing millions of people from the voters' rolls in Florida, but without any clarification about how many were actually foreign nationals, and without any clarification with respect to whether or not they'd actually voted. We've heard again about Pennsylvania, but there's no evidence to back up the assertion that was made that 100,000 non-citizens had been registered to vote. That's actually been disputed repeatedly. So it seems Ms. Mitchell is playing fast and loose with the facts in order to, you know, further this conspiracy theory. Ms. Senteno, we talked earlier about the civil rights advocates in Pennsylvania who challenged a misguided voter ID law that would have disenfranchised almost 500,000 people. And it would have meant that IDs like care facility IDs, retired and veteran, military and veteran IDs, student IDs, and more were inadequate to vote with. And we know that other policies that construct unnecessary barriers to voting, like the SAVE Act, disproportionately impact students, military, disabled folks, elderly folks, minority and low-income folks. Can you talk about why these types of proposals are such a burden on these populations?
Yes, thank you. I want to start from the premise that if a state is going to burden the right to vote, there must be evidence to justify it. The fact is that stringent voter identification requirements impose real costs on democracy and specifically on voters. In 2006, the Brennan Center for Justice found that 25% of African Americans and 16% of Latinos did not have a current valid government-issued photo ID compared to 11% of all U.S. citizens surveyed. So many state-issued IDs, they're generally offered for free in states that require voters to display them to vote, but the documents that voters must obtain in order to get those free IDs themselves are not necessarily free. And the opportunity to obtain those documents are also not equal across different demographics and income levels. And so just in Texas, in order to obtain a birth certificate, it's $23 at minimum. Or if you need to obtain a certificate of citizenship, the price for that is over $1,300 to obtain that document. So when you take into account the time and expense necessary to gather those documents, it is very clear that this puts a disproportionate burden on voters of color, on poor voters, on voters with disability, on the elderly, and on young voters.
And that is exactly what we saw in Pennsylvania. I'm particularly concerned about suppression of young people's votes. Particularly as at least one of the majority's witnesses has been an outspoken proponent of making it more difficult for college students to vote. Student IDs are not considered an acceptable form of ID to vote under the SAVE Act, even if coupled with additional proof of citizenship. And many young people these days don't have driver's licenses or even passports. So can you talk about why this proposal and other similar voter suppression tactics are particularly harmful to our young voters, our newest voters?
Yes, that's exactly right. Obtaining an acceptable photo ID can be especially difficult for young people, and student IDs are one of the easiest and affordable ways for students to prove their identity. For the Latino community, this is a particularly concerning issue given that the Latino population nationally is comparatively young. The median age of Latinos is 30.4 years compared to 38.9 for the total population, and more than a quarter of K through 12 students are Latino. This is the future of the U.S. electorate. So when you combine these factors with the expense and difficulties of obtaining necessary documents to obtain certain types of identifications, versus a student ID, the result really is the suppression of young voters who are more likely to be voters of color.
Ms. Senteno, according to a recent New York Times article in late July, MAGA activists affiliated with Ms. Mitchell's Election Integrity Network met on a Zoom call to discuss how to keep undocumented immigrants from voting in November, a problem they claim inaccurately to be a looming threat to a fair election. The article quoted one participant suggesting that school enrollment figures be assessed to find neighborhoods with large numbers of immigrants, while another activist recommended hanging up signs in ethnic neighborhoods warning people not to vote if they were not eligible, and reportedly said, I think it's unfortunate, but sometimes the only way you can find out is to look for ethnic names. I believe Ms. Mitchell has also advocated for having town watch type operations at departments of motor vehicles. How does disinformation about non-citizen voting and voter suppression, couched as election integrity, predictably lead to the targeting of Latino citizens and other voters of color?
Yes, so I think this goes back to the misperception of who is the Latino community and the assumption that large populations of Latino communities are going to be areas where there are mostly non-citizens. In order to assume that, Latino populations are inherently all non-citizen, it would really be making an assumption based inappropriately on race. And so voter disinformation in this way very predictably targets Latinos because of that misperception of who we are and the assumption that we are not predominantly U.S. citizens and therefore eligible to vote in the United States. It's incredibly harmful and ultimately results in the disenfranchisement of Latino voters, of naturalized citizens, and voters of color.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. I will now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would just start by saying thank you to you for working with me on the underlying bill of the SAVE Act, in that most people don't know this, but North Dakota is unique in the country. We are the only state without voter registration. We also have what I believe to be the best voter ID citizen voting law in the country. So you can do both, and it was seriously helpful to make sure we could get the bill in a place where it didn't affect 400,000 of my constituents, every primary and every general. And with that, I yield to you.
I thank my friend from North Dakota, and I was proud to work with him and the rest of my colleagues to make sure that the bill is comprehensive in its impact and what it's trying to attempt to do, but also frankly avoids a lot of what is being alleged that it would do. Ms. Mitchell, if you might respond to some of the allegations that were just made, the bill specifically contemplates ensuring through its own text that those that are naturalized would get materials, there'd be a requirement under law that the federal government would get those materials to states immediately, so it would avoid the problem of those who are naturalized having not have the documentation necessary, as well as providing for a mechanism by which an individual can go and register to vote with the sworn affidavit of those that are there in the officials in the local government, acknowledging that they've done what they need to do to present the information. In other words, we provide every means possible. Would Ms. Mitchell agree with that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I think that one of the things that's really important is to actually read the bill. And if you read the bill, then you will understand that there's a whole laundry list of types of documentation that can be used, and there are a couple of fail-safe follow-ups, and then there's a catch-all, which is, or any other reasonable approach that the election officials may decide. There's really no reason to make that the boogeyman. The problem is that we have a very porous voter registration system in this country, right, and we have to do something to protect the integrity of our elections.
Would you agree that the construct under the SAVE Act is far less onerous than that of numerous states, including New York, Pennsylvania, and other states, in terms of what they have to do for driver's licenses, for example?
Well, yes, and here's the other thing. Congress passed the Real ID law years ago, and in order to get a Real ID, you don't have to be a citizen, but you do have to provide either your citizenship data or you have to provide your paperwork showing that you're in the country legally, that you're a permanent resident with a green card. So Congress has already addressed the issue in a context with which Congress cared about, which is that we want to protect federal buildings, federal military installations, and commercial aircraft from people who we want to know who they are when they're entering those facilities. And so Congress has already taken the step to identify a process, and I don't know why voting should be any less susceptible to improper.
I agree. Secretary Byrd, I'd like to turn to you, and I appreciate you being here again and illuminating how you guys are engaging with it in Florida. Does the Constitution give states primary jurisdiction over elections?
It does, Article 1, Section 4.
If the state of Florida passed a law requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections, they did that right now, without the SAVE Act, would you be able to enforce that law under existing law and precedent?
We would not. We'd be in violation of the NVRA.
And can you explain that quickly for the average viewer?
Sure. Well, the NVRA prohibits states from requiring citizenship documentation on the front end when somebody registers to vote. So we are in federal courts and interpreting the NVRA. Most recently, the United States Supreme Court has said that we cannot require that proof of citizenship. We have to add the person to the rolls, and then only on the back end do the list maintenance. And so in essence, we're playing whack-a-mole with people who we've seen repeatedly register and removed because we can't require the information on the front end.
Am I correct that Florida was only able to really truly gain access to the SAVE system because you sued to do so?
That is correct.
So states have barriers in order to get to the federal government, in order to get the information necessary to determine who citizens are in the first place, correct?
That is correct.
Florida sued in order to gain access to the SAVE system, but am I correct that the SAVE system is still inferior in terms of you being able to have access to the information needed to check citizenship?
Woefully inadequate, untimely, it costs the states money, and many times we don't have the information necessary from the individual attempting to register to vote to gain access, which then we don't have the verification, even when we do have access to it.
So without the SAVE Act, can you, as Secretary of State, be as confident as you feel you should be that we know we do not have citizens voting in the state of Florida, non-citizens voting in the state of Florida?
It makes it very difficult to fulfill my constitutional duties.
I would now yield time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt.
The fundamental question that we must answer today is is America worth preserving? I, of course, think it is. I think this is the greatest country in the world. I love this country. I'm a veteran, served in combat, and I'm a United States congressman. I think this is by far the greatest country in the world. But if the United States is a country worth preserving, then I think we must protect the integrity of our elections and do everything in our power to do just that. I am shocked that the SAVE Act, which has already passed the House in a bipartisan fashion, is even controversial to many Democrats. I mean, they are the ones that constantly are shouting about preserving democracy. And safeguarding our elections is the bedrock of our democracy. It's something that both sides should easily support and agree upon. They say that non-citizens voting in an election is not a real issue, or if some non-citizens are registered to vote, it's not a significant amount to make a difference. Well, in my home state of Texas, we just removed thousands of non-citizens from voter rolls. And in some of these recently hotly contested elections, that amount could even be enough to swing an entire election, especially this year. Undermining the integrity of elections is not an oversight. It's a threat to democracy. And for all of those, this is about democracy. For all of us, this should be about democracy. I think it's time that we, as a body, acknowledge that threat. Now, Democrats on the left aren't just focused on replacing American voters, they are focused on replacing American jobs as well. Under the Biden-Harris administration, jobs in foreign-born workers are significantly increasing, while jobs for native-born workers are declining. Critics say that these illegal immigrants are needed because they will do the jobs that Americans won't do. And what they fail to say is that Americans won't do the jobs when Bidenflation is outpacing their wages. And fixing the illegal immigration problem will help American workers. I fixed a problem for you. The immigration problem is not a minimum wage issue. It hasn't always been the case, but in recent years, the left has decided to slowly erode everything that we'd hold dear as a country. They want to erode our culture, our history, our patriotism, and lastly, our vote. Do you remember during the George Floyd riots when the left wanted to reimagine policing? Now, the left wants to reimagine voting, so that everyone, regardless of their citizenship, can choose our next president. That's not the American way. The left wants to reimagine everything that makes America special. They even want to reimagine our Constitution. One example is a recent New York Times article, and the title speaks to itself. The Constitution is sacred. It is also dangerous. One of the biggest threats to American politics might be the country's founding documents, said the author. Now, I'm sitting here right now, and I got to tell y'all, I'm black, and I'm a veteran. I have 6 forms of government ID. 6. I've been black for my whole life. I've been a veteran since 2000 when I was at West Point. The insinuation that black and brown people cannot get an ID to vote like every other citizen, regardless of your race, religion, color, or creed, is insulting. I actually refer to this as the soft bigotry of low expectations. We, as all Americans, should want free and fair elections. We aren't making it more difficult for people to get an ID to vote. I have an 18-month-old little boy. Do you know the first thing that he got when he was born that I had to sign for? A birth certificate. So the idea of this costing thousands of dollars and it's all of a sudden onerous and burdensome on Hispanic people and black people like me is absurd. I have a very large family. My mom has 8 brothers and sisters. Every last black person that I know in my life, which is quite a few, every last one of them has a government ID. It would be insulting to talk to my family and say to them, you know what, sorry, y'all, you're black and it's just, so hard for you to get an ID like all the white people. That's absurd. And we as a country have got to reject this farce. I speak so strongly against this because I view myself as an American first. I am a veteran. I am a husband. I am a congressman. I'm someone that served this country. I'm an educated black man. And somewhere down the line, I am black and I am proud, and I understand that. But what I never want to do is marginalize a single group in this country by saying that you weren't good enough to get an ID, because my 18-month-old has an ID. We as a country have got to clean up our rules to ensure that we have free and fair elections regardless of your race, religion, color, or creed. And that's why I reject the assertion that we, no matter what color you are, cannot reach that very low bar of having a government ID to figure out how to vote for the leadership and the future of this country. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Texas first time. I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for some unanimous consent requests.
Thank you. I have some unanimous consent requests. First, an article from the September 5 New York Times entitled "Republicans Seize on False Theories About Immigrant Voting." A March 13th, 2024 article from NPR, "Conservatives are warning about non-citizens voting. It's a myth with a long history." Another NPR article from August 30th, 2024, "The GOP is making false claims about non-citizens voting. It's affecting real voters." An article from this week, "Elon Musk's misleading election claims reach millions and alarm election officials." And an article from September 7th, 2024, New York Times, "Heritage Foundation spreads deceptive videos about non-citizen voters."
Without objection, those will be entered into the record.
Thank you.
I will now recognize my friend and the gentleman from North Carolina. I assume he has no unanimous requests for New York Times or NPR articles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Senteno, I don't know if you were shocked, but Congressman Hunt just said he has an ID. Were you shocked by that or surprised by it?
Was I surprised? No.
No. Do you think generally people who are naturalized citizens take pride in that accomplishment?
I would assume yes.
Are you familiar with the educational process accompanying naturalization?
Yes.
Do they impart that becoming a naturalized citizen is what you have to do in order to be able to vote, and that you have the voting right, the franchise, by virtue of being naturalized?
It would be my understanding, but if I can't tell you specifically whether that's part of the curriculum or how that comes about.
Do you think someone who has worked hard and followed the process to become a naturalized citizen would take offense at the prospect of their vote being diluted by people who are not citizens having access to the vote?
I can't speculate as to what a specific individual may or may not believe about their vote. What I can say is that the idea that a vote is being canceled out because of widespread non-citizen voting is simply false. We have no evidence that there is widespread non-citizen voting, and we have no evidence that votes have been canceled out by something that we haven't been able to prove.
Well, let me first say, I don't think it requires speculation. I'm pretty sure that someone who is striven to become a United States citizen, has accomplished that landmark in their life, I think they'd be proud of the right to vote. I think they would be absolutely committed to the idea that folks who haven't gone through the same process that they've done and accomplished the same outcome should not be voting. Why is the lack of evidence that it is happening on a widespread basis a reason not to guard against it?
Because when we know that there is no evidence of widespread non-citizen voting, but we do know that documentary proof of citizenship laws prevent eligible citizens from registering to vote, it's simply bad public policy.
How do they prevent them?
We have lots of evidence that documentary proof of citizenship, restrictive voter laws, prevent U.S. citizens from exercising their right to vote by preventing them from being on the voter rolls.
Same idea as like Congressman Hunt not being able to get an ID?
Obtaining documentation is incredibly difficult for many individuals.
That's the same point he was making. I get it. All right, how about that, Ms. Mitchell? What about that?
Well, I just don't believe that people in this, the vast majority of people are able to get IDs, they're able to get their documentary proof of citizenship, and they're doing it every day by the millions. The problem is that we don't care enough about our voting system to make certain that we treat it with the respect that it deserves. We require it for people to get a real ID, but not to register to vote. And we make it impossible. We make it very difficult for states to be able to ascertain who is and who is not a citizen for voting purposes. Once they get on the list, I just read during the recess that the Department of Justice sent out a memo today to people all over the country, election officials, reminding them that they are not allowed to remove ineligible voters because now is the blackout period. Well, that's not even actually true. But it just goes to show you that this Justice Department can produce a memo of guidance on issues that it cares about.
Right. Well, you say it doesn't. It's not a question that they, I think you meant universally, don't care enough about our voting, but it's actually, there's another prospect there, isn't it? That is, it's not a question of not caring about our voting. It's actually an intention to see to it that the circumstances are chaotic enough that a vote that you depend on that cannot legitimately cast nonetheless has the opportunity to be cast. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right. And they throw around the insults and the accusations that you're a racist, you're a vote suppressor.
Isn't that the best technique? If you're trying to see to it that non-citizens vote and turn the margin in close races, and you consider that to be essential to your political success, then what are you going to do? You're going to say, one, we don't think there's a problem, and two, you're a racist if you suggest that we enforce the law. Isn't that what you do if you want to?
Absolutely. And the other thing is there's always this discussion of there's no widespread. Well, number one, how do we know?
They don't know.
How do we know? We don't know. We know that non-citizens are registering. We know that non-citizens are voting. How do we know whether it is or isn't widespread if we don't investigate it, if we don't make it a priority, if we don't require documentation?
As is sometimes said, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. I would now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Secretary Byrd, there have been a variety of attacks levied against House Republicans for advocating for election integrity, which includes preventing non-citizen voting, and they are based on non-citizen voting already being illegal. Just because non-citizen voting is illegal doesn't mean that it can't occur, and we must be vigilant in ensuring the strength of our laws. House Rule 10, Clause 2, lays out the general oversight responsibilities of the standing committees to analyze, quote, the application, administration, execution, and effectiveness of federal laws, end quote. And also, quote, conditions and circumstances that may indicate the necessity or desirability of enacting new or additional legislation, end quote. Secretary Byrd, very simply, is it possible for non-citizens to illegally vote in federal elections?
It is.
And do you have examples of this occurring?
We do. I mentioned 2 individuals in Florida who've been recently arrested and charged with illegally attempting to vote in Florida elections.
And both of those situations occurred after Congress made it illegal for non-citizens to vote, correct?
That is correct.
Do you think Congress should consider legislation such as the SAVE Act to close the gaps which allow non-citizens voting?
It is absolutely critical.
Okay. Is amending the NVRA an important first step?
The NVRA must be amended.
And can states, when administering services such as social and medical benefits, impact either intentionally or unintentionally the federal prohibition on non-citizens votings?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you about President Biden's Executive Order 14019 on promoting access to voting. Can you speak to some of the concerns with this executive order?
Absolutely. First of all, I believe that it's unconstitutional. But having said that, why is it that the Biden administration has absolutely resisted every effort to turn over any of the plans by any of the agencies? The House Committee on Administration issued subpoenas in July to every cabinet secretary and have asking for the plans for implementing Executive Order 14019. And not a single agency plan has been turned over to the House Administration Committee. And I included in my written testimony a file from a whistleblower who sent to me. He is a U.S. Marshal, and he sent the Department of Justice guidelines, instructions to all the U.S. Marshals, requiring them, notifying them that they are required to offer voter registration materials and voter education materials to everyone with whom they come into contact, including, and he sent me a file of someone who had to be registered to vote, who is a prisoner in a Texas federal facility. He's imprisoned for violating federal law because he was deported and returned. He's a Mexican citizen. It says that in his file, and he was registered to vote, and they're required to give him voter registration materials. That is happening in federal prisons all over the country.
So let me ask you, then, is it your understanding that they are actually implementing the very plans that they refuse to turn over to Congress?
They're absolutely doing that, and we only know, we get bits and snatches from people, from whistleblowers and from various sources, but nothing official. And if you want to know the most, you go to the Demos website, which is a left-wing organization, and they have literally been dispatched by the White House to federal agencies to help them implement this plan. They know more about what's going on in these agencies to implement this executive order than any member of Congress.
Are they involved with implementing the executive order?
Yes, they are.
And are they in compliance with FACA or the Federal Advisory Committee Act?
No, they are not. No, they are not.
So they're violating FACA.
They are violating that. Yes, they are. And they brag about all the agencies that they have assisted over the last 3 years with implementing the executive order.
This executive order obviously involves these various federal agencies in the voting process. And besides the concern that these agencies do not have expertise in this area, should the American people be concerned that this will be administered by politically appointed officials of the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, absolutely, because the original executive order required that every plan had to be submitted to the White House, to the director of the Office of Domestic Policy, which at the time was held by Susan Rice. And it also goes on to say that federal funds and grants will be disseminated through the White House by the Office of Domestic Policy, by Susan Rice, and we do not know to this day who got the grants, how much they got. We know nothing about that.
So in terms of these plans, were they all submitted to the White House for review?
We presume that they were, because they were directed to do that, but we don't know.
And they're being implemented as we speak.
They are being implemented.
But we as Congress have not been able to get our hands on the documents.
Not a single document.
I guess I have a question. Why would they want to hide this information?
That's a good question.
I yield back.
I think the gentlelady from Wyoming recognize my friend from Pennsylvania for unanimous consent request.
Knowing how much you love NPR articles, I would introduce June 30th, 2024 article, Republicans are turning Biden's voter registration order into a partisan flashpoint.
Without objection.
And also enter the Brennan Center for Justice report entitled Non-Citizen Voting, the Missing Millions. That's
Without
the
objection.
2017 report we were discussing.
Without objection.
Okay.
I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I think the gentlelady from Wyoming. Question for you, Ms. Senteno, and I apologize, I think I was not pronouncing it exactly correct. But Ms. Senteno, how many Democrats voted for the SAVE Act in July?
I'm not aware. I can look into it and get back to you.
It would five Democrats voted for it, and 3 of whom are Hispanic, one of whom is black. Do you believe that their vote was a discriminatory vote?
Do I believe their votes were discriminatory?
Right. Do you believe those votes, or that they supported that or voted for that because they support discriminating against minority voters?
I believe that those votes are bad public policy.
Ms. Jenks, you mentioned earlier, but I want to explore just a little further, that last Congress, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle passed legislation, the Dream and Promise Act, that in part allows DHS to waive the inadmissibility of aliens that illegally voted if doing so is deemed to be in the public interest. Now, why would they do that if there's not a problem with people who are illegally present in the United States voting?
There's only one reason to do that, and that is that illegal aliens are voting. I mean, there's no other explanation. And by the way, the American Dream and Promise Act that was introduced in this Congress contains the same provision. And the U.S. Citizenship Act that the Biden administration wrote and submitted to Congress in like the first week is worse because it actually automatically waives non-citizen voting and false claims to U.S. citizenship, so registering to vote.
How many illegal aliens has the Biden-Harris regime allowed into the country in their tenure?
At least 7.5 million allowed to enter into the country and remain.
And that number comes from public sources, right? The government reported sources of the number of releases into the United States, correct, whether they're unaccompanied alien children or whether they're notices to appear under the parole program, via the CBP One app, whatever it is, the releases under the administration's policies, which total somewhere in the range of 5.5 million plus the roughly 2 million gotaways. Is that correct?
Yes.
So 7.5 million people now in the United States. If just 1% of those individuals, we're talking, doing math in my head real quick, is that 75,000? If 1% of those individuals were to register to vote, that's a pretty significant number, correct? That could have a significant impact on elections in states where, for example, Al Franken won his Minnesota Senate seat by 300 votes, where a number of congressional colleagues of ours have won by 300 and something votes, where Merritt Miller Meeks won by 6 votes. So would you agree that's a pretty significant number?
Absolutely. And it's not just the 7.5 million illegal aliens, it's also the rest of the non-citizens who are in the country. So legal immigrants, refugees, they're all foreign students, all of these categories of non-citizens, all of them representing 30 million people, some percentage are voting.
Ms. Mitchell, there have been concerns stated by some colleagues, frankly on both sides of the aisle, that if we pass the SAVE Act today, about 2 months out before the election, that it would have a limited impact. Now, my perspective and my answer, I want to see if you would agree, is that the SAVE Act is effective at the time of enactment. That's how it's designed. That is how it's written. That 22 states and the District of Columbia allow voters to register to vote on Election Day, meaning passing the SAVE Act would have an impact all the way up to Election Day. That the SAVE Act also requires all states to remove non-citizens from their existing roles through Election Day and gives them the tools to do so that we've discussed, access to the databases that we've talked about. And so would you agree that even if we pass the SAVE Act now or in the coming week or two, that it would have a massive impact on securing the 2024 election?
I absolutely do, and that's why I think it's so important that you're having this hearing, and I think it's so important for Congress to pass the SAVE Act for it to become effective immediately.
Is there, Mr. Secretary Byrd, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, what the SAVE Act or what the NVRA prohibits is a systematic removal process. States can still do an individualized process per person. If we had more access to more information, we could definitely do more list maintenance, which is critical to ensuring a fair election and trust in the electorate.
Without the SAVE Act or something similar, are you able to know how many people slip through the cracks and vote illegally or illegally present in the United States and vote in the state of Florida?
It makes it very, very difficult to near impossible.
Well, I appreciate that. And now I'm going to yield back the balance of my time, and I'm going to recognize my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Chairman, for having this hearing today. I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I have a little bit of deja vu. I served in the state legislature, and even before that, I followed the arguments about voter ID. And the clarion call from the Democrats was this is going to suppress turnout, that it's going to limit people from exercising their right to vote, that it was going to have disastrous effects on South Carolina voting, and it has done everything but that. In fact, turnout is much better now with voter ID in South Carolina and in other states. And so the arguments against common sense things that, quite frankly, the American people like, I mean, you asked, the SAVE Act polls incredibly well, not only amongst Republicans, but amongst Democrats and independents. Really all parts of our country support this, except when you cross the Potomac into Washington, D.C., and you hear the ranking member say that it's going to have, one of the myths is that it was going to hurt voters because they would have to provide documents. And the reality is, according to the bill, for applicants without supporting documentation of citizenship, the SAVE Act permits state officials to check a variety of state and federal databases. Another myth was that it would somehow delay their registration, but the bill text is pretty clear as well, that they would be able to do that within 24 hours of accepting that application. And so, again, I just go back and fundamentally reject, because in the plain language of the text itself, it does the exact opposite of what the ranking member was referring to. And so, Ms. Mitchell, I want to go to you because in your testimony, and I really want to explore this, there was a DOJ order from President Biden, Executive Order 14019. A whistleblower came forward. You were talking with them and working with them on a report. Talk to us about what that executive order was, what it did, and the contents of your findings, just briefly.
Well, the executive order is word for word the executive order that Bill Clinton issued after the National Voter Registration Act was enacted by Congress in 1993. The difference is Congress did not take any action to authorize federal agencies to spend federal tax dollars and federal employees' time and federal resources to register people to vote. There's no congressional authority for it, and the chief executive has no authority to order anything with regard to voter registration. So the fact is that it is an order that's based on the NVRA. It orders every federal agency to develop a plan. That plan was supposed to be submitted to the White House by September of 2021, and it was to say how this agency planned to implement and conduct voter registration. And more problematic to me are the voter education materials, which is a euphemism in Democrat voter parlance for get out the vote. I don't want my federal tax dollars being spent to turn out voters, because I know the voters that they're going to turn out. And I don't think that they're treating all citizens equally. They're treating certain populations differently with our tax dollars.
And I would echo
think
that,
it's legal.
Ms. Mitchell, I mean, particularly from non-citizen prisoners, right? But that's kind of where at least the U.S. Marshals and the DOJ were going with this. Is that correct?
And in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and that there's no safeguard in the executive order saying, now be certain that you follow state law and that you don't register felons to vote, and be certain that you follow federal law and you're not registering non-citizens to vote. You don't have to be a citizen to go into get food stamps or other kinds of benefits. You don't have to be a citizen, but these employees are ordered to nonetheless register them to vote.
All right, equally troubling. I think you know, when you look at the legal framework of this, an illegal alien, by registering, say, with some social services, is given an application possibly to vote. And it might be a mistake, but regardless, they are given that option based on this executive order. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right, sir.
And so it's pretty easy to get added to the voter rolls, but it is nearly impossible to get removed.
That's exactly right.
Isn't that the conundrum that we find ourselves in?
That is exactly right.
And isn't that what the SAVE Act would protect and prohibit and fight against, is give states that option to remove non-citizens from their voting rolls?
That's right, and to keep them from getting on the rolls in the first place.
And why, Ms. Mitchell, then, is it so hard to understand that, or so problematic for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to think that that was actually a pretty decent policy that non-citizens should not be voting in United States elections?
Because they don't agree with that premise. They want non-citizens to be counted for all purposes. They want non-citizens to be voting. The state of Vermont, controlled by Democrats, has now extended that right to all non-citizens in the state. San Francisco, New York, the District of Columbia. The Democrats have voted to, we see the pattern. They vote for non-citizens. They vote against anything that would keep non-citizens from being recognized as an important and critical part of our political system.
So say one thing and do another. Sounds like Washington, D.C. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina. I thank the witnesses. Let me allow the ranking member, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, to insert some more documents into the record.
Thank you. We've had a lot of discussion here about the executive order or the voter registration list maintenance guidance that the DOJ published just in September, making clear that that Congress has already dictated what has to be done with respect to list maintenance and set those restrictions. Not that it's anything new by this administration. I'd also like to put in a Washington Post article, top GOP lawyer decries ease of campus voting in private pitch to RNC, presentation by Cleta Mitchell at donor retreat, urged tougher rules that could make it harder for college students to cast ballots. Second one, and finally, Rep. Chip Roy says election deniers in Project 2025 contributors helped draft the SAVE Act.
Was there a specific request on the thing you mentioned from DOJ? Was it a specific,
sorry.
What was the actual document?
Just to put in the document since it was referenced
Got it, okay.
repeatedly here.
Okay.
And then the Washington Post article
Got it.
and the Media Matters article.
Without objection, I just want to be clear. Without objection.
Thank you.
With that, this concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.